this pretty quickly. The, the intent of this first chart is, number one, to sort of make sure that anybody who hasn't been paying attention close enough realizes that that's not me in the big black airplane, that's me in the big silver airplane in front, offloading the fuel. And so this was my first assignment when I was first in the Air Force and out of the academy. So we're talking late 1970s and early 1980s. So I'll also be sharing with you a little bit of what the technology was like back then. For instance, if we were going to deploy from Beale Air Force Base in Northern California to Kadena Air Base, we would push a sextant up through the top of the cockpit and shoot the stars to make sure that we landed in Okinawa and not Red China. And I have also a special spot there across the top of the screen that shows you if you really love pictures of SR-71s, I've got a special area in my website where you can go look at them. The next chart, let's see. Oh, it's doing that thing, Ken, so I'll do this. The next chart is just sort of this big summary of a lot of things I've done. And this is where I usually say that I also go around and talk about sustainment of complex systems, and I'll put a plug in for the Los Angeles, Las Vegas newsletter. I've been doing a 7-part series on sustainment of complex systems. I think we're up to part 4 this month. And let's see, on to the next chart. I like to show this one just because I enjoy this sort of 50,000 mile view of my career. I guess I've sort of given you the bona fides that I have actually worked in a lot of aerospace across my career, but I'm not going to loiter on this one. I'm going to loiter on this one a little bit because, especially if there's younger folks here who haven't decided what their dreams are, or decided to follow with their dreams, I always like to put this one up to show that, hey, you know, you're raised as a single parent family. My father passed away when I was 5. I was raised with a crazy mother and 2 crazy sisters in a 900-foot square house in Wasco. And most people there were thinking about either working on the farm, the oil fields, or something of that nature. But I started to realize at an early age that maybe I could do something else. And I think of all the different obstacles that anybody faces in trying to go and do what they want to do, the biggest one is realizing that you have a shot. You should figure out what your dream is and go try for it. Now, that little kid standing there next to that Air Force jet, he really was thinking of being an astronaut. And so I didn't quite make it that far, but I sure had a heck of a fun career. These are the 3 things I'm going to be talking about. I like to give people a lot of context about what it was like back in the late 70s and what we were doing and why we were doing it. And I find that I really need to go all the way back to the rise of modern industrial warfare to explain why we found ourselves in the Cold War. And then with that as a background, I could hopefully spend most of my time talking about the technologies and the stories of refueling SR-71s in flight. So that's where I'm leading you today. Let's see. And so starting off in that first section of the rise of modern industrial warfare, I love this photo because it captures so much. First of all, it looks fairly ridiculous, and a lot of things that the Air Force and the Army Air Corps tried to do looked fairly ridiculous when they started. This is a British officer in the Great War in one of those small airplanes, seriously trying to bomb the ground. That's a serious bomb. You could tell it's got the spinner on the back of it so that as he releases it and that heavier weight on the front drops it down and the fins stabilize it, that it'll fuse because that little propeller is spinning, and when that bottom hits the ground, it explodes. Now, the level of accuracy at this point in time in strategic bombing was, I think we could categorize it as non-existent, but it's important to remember that that's where we were at that point in time. But we really need to also remember that first industrial war was a civil war in the United States. And we had an Air Force back then. In fact, we had a wonderful guy by the name of Professor Thaddeus Lowe, which was very much a carnival huckster and barker and, not a real professor of anything, but he sure knew how to promote himself. And he convinced President Lincoln that he needed balloons to appear over the front lines and tell the Union officers and generals what was going on. And the fact of the matter is that he really did make a difference in the Civil War, and did things like, for instance, saved an entire general's army one day with his intel. This balloon would be tethered. It would have a telegraph coin up to it. Those are huge wagons of hydrochloric acid to produce the hydrogen. But I just want to sort of hit on the same theme of the carnival barker nature of aerospace. Back in the day, he found himself a pretty young wife in Paris, and she came with him, and she worked with him by his side during the Civil War. And one time, when he was shot down in his balloon, she put on makeup, got a hold of a buckboard, and drove across enemy lines dressed as an old hag and rescued him from the Confederates. So probably spent too much time on that chart, but it's a fun setup of just how you have to think way outside the box, especially in the early days. Now, another reminder here, early 1900s, you have the Great War, World War I, you have the Spanish Civil War, characterized by the fact that you had these trenches that were built because of the fact that the machine guns were such highly efficient industrial killing machines that you were forced down into trench warfare. And then the Spanish Civil War was a demonstration to everybody that you could do some phenomenal damage from the air. And that's, of course, Picasso's famous drawing of Guernica, I'm not pronouncing it right, Guernica, I think is the right pronunciation. But enough on that chart. That chart introduces the fact that top leaders of World War II, and now we start talking about World War II, we're getting very close to the Cold War. The top leaders in World War II, like Curtis LeMay, were young officers in the Army Signal Corps Aviation Section in the 30s. And they took a very classic Clausewitz document on war, Von Krieg, and they took that and they combined it with the new technology they had of aircraft, and they told the world that what they could really do was they could fly over these trenches. They could fly over the enemy lines. We didn't have to fight World War II, or we didn't have to fight World War I again with the trench warfare. We would fly right up over the trenches, and we would go bomb the center of gravity of the nation that was trying to defeat us or win the war. And that center of gravity would be their industry. So they built up this entire air doctrine around the ability to get over those front lines and drop bombs on the enemy's industry. It still left open a lot of questions like, what should we bomb? Turned out in World War II, the most important thing they could bomb was railways, oil refineries, and ball bearing plants. But it took them a little while to figure that out. Fortunately, they had an ally in FDR who, before the war, enabled him to build things like the B-17. So we went into the war with this idea that we had a strategic air doctrine that we could carry out. And in fact, it made a difference in D-Day and in winning the war. And so that leads us to, well, I'm going to take a slight detour here before it leads us to our conclusion chart. And that is to say, like the introduction mentioned, my dad was a participant in that air warfare World War II. He was a B-24 ball turret gunner. So you can imagine he's about 5'4", immigrant Italian, 5'4" tall, and could fit in that tiny little ball. Up in the upper right-hand corner of this chart, what you see is the formation that's designed so that these gunners can protect all the other aircraft in the formation from other, well, basically from the German Luftwaffe, because he flew up the Adriatic in order to bomb areas like those oil refineries I talked about. And so that was a very key job, of course, World War II. He survived the war, but died about 10 years later from heart disease. This is the person I was named after, his brother, who's also a gunner, but in the Pacific. So this is the chart I wanted to get to, which sort of ties together the whole genesis and start of the Cold War. We went into World War II claiming that we knew how to fly across the enemy lines and deliver death and destruction to the enemy's industry. And we finished World War II not only by proving that in Europe, because we were able to launch a D-Day invasion with the Germans having vastly fewer resources than they would have had if we hadn't been attacking them constantly throughout the first part of the war. But by the end of the war in Japan, we were no longer in this position of flying entire fleets of aircraft, but one aircraft, one bomb, one city. That is what they like to say nowadays, a real game changer, a real disruptor in how the world works. And so even though the fact that General LeMay had his B-29s flying daily raids over places like Tokyo and firebombing these cities and killing 80 to 100,000 people every night, the Japanese were not inclined to surrender. They thought they had a path ahead that they could take, but the sheer shock value of one aircraft, one bomb, one city done twice in a row, and they didn't know we couldn't do it 3, 4, 5, 6 times in a row. We had to actually go back and build more bombs, but they didn't know that. That stopped that war. But it started this new era where all of us smart Americans came back to our country, and we looked at the map again and we said, you know what? The Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, they're no longer a huge protection for us. And a lot of the top key leaders were talking about the dangers that we would be in from attack by aircraft from other places, like, for instance, Russia, USSR, that retained their aircraft and their capabilities. And the people that weren't quite convinced early in the 50s got very convinced after Sputnik was launched and started figuring out that, okay, maybe they don't even need airplanes. So this was the feeling in the 50s and 60s, of course, as I was growing up, that we definitely were not safe, protected by the northern wastes and the 2 major oceans. We needed to be thinking about defense. And the idea of an atomic war was so horrendous, it was hard for us to think of how we could come up with this sort of defense or aggression that would avoid atomic war for us. But as you all know, the spoiler on this story is we came up with this idea of deterrence and a triad of deterrence. Sea-launched ballistic missiles in the Navy, they're survivable, they're hard to find, they're sort of the last ditch. If they were ever able to deal with all the manned bombers and all the ICBMs, the SLBMs would still be there. So the idea is that if we're constantly holding a gun to the head of a major power like Russia, they're not going to see that it's a good bet to try to attack us, because they would be retaliated against right away. I spent 25 years sustaining ICBMs, and the nice thing about ICBMs is they're responsive, they're on alert, they're targeted, they're called Minuteman for a reason. They know exactly where they're going and they can get there, but more important is they're buried in underground silos across the northern tier that do not have to be launched before an attack. The idea that ICBMs could respond after we've been attacked as a nation means that increases the deterrence calculus. Now, the problem with SLBMs and ICBMs is that they're not very visible. So if you're a politician or a leader in the country and you're trying to send a message to another country that, hey, you are really starting to get close to the edge of war here, and we don't like what you're doing, man bombers are available because they're recallable, they're flexible, they can send a message. So that's the reason we have a triad. And I would just like to say this is the logic of the late 70s and early 80s and what got us through the Cold War and beyond the Cold War. I would like to appeal to anybody in this audience today who's perhaps in their 20s or 30s, or even, you got to remember the millennials are approaching 40s now. You guys really need to be kicking out us baby boomers and taking over and coming up with a better idea than this, because I'm not sure this is going to work all throughout this next century. But that seemed to work really well for us, and it leads us to this sort of a feeling that was pervasive with me as a kid. I was born in 1952. I still had this feeling that as much as people were concerned and worried about war and worried about the bomb and the drills that we ran jumping under our desks in school, there was also in parallel this whole nother thing that was going on, which was huge amount of optimism about the technology, that we were entering a push button age, that everything that we could think of, we'd be able to do. You'd be able to summon your doctor using some kind of a paging system. You'd be able to talk to people on a video phone. Crazy stuff. And of course, all the ads for cars the cars had fins, and they were in pictures next to big supersonic airplanes. So I've got another section in my website where I've just got a whole bunch of pictures of these, finned cars sitting next to 1950s aircraft. Now, not every idea we came up with was really super. There was this idea where we wanted to combine jet aircraft with nuclear power plants. And fortunately, we never really allowed that to continue. The Russians actually flew a couple of sorties with a nuclear reactor on board, but smarter heads prevailed in the US Air Force, so we never actually launched any of these crazy ideas, because you always have to ask yourself the question, what happens if everything doesn't go well, which happened a lot during my career. But let's get into the SR-71 era finally, after we're about 20 minutes into our discussion, and we're finally got some pictures of SR-71s. Now, I want to talk about the technology here of this age, because the Cold War was 1947 to 1991, which is also roughly the era of the SR-71. And like I sort of implied earlier, it was this age of technological marvels. Down in the lower left there, that's our modern computers of the 1950s that people thought someday we might be able to reduce down to maybe a half a ton. In fact, we were able to reduce them down to what we called microcomputers that we could put aboard our ICBMs. We couldn't fit them on that ICBM, but we could fit them in the top of our Minutemans, something that was 33 pounds and had was about 40 pounds, and it had 33 cards of NAND gates on it, was the sort of Apollo era technology that went into our 1970s Minuteman ICBMs. That's all I wanted to say on that chart. So we need to know, as a nation, where all their rockets are, where all their bombers are, so that we don't get surprised. The worst thing that can happen if the world is on the edge of a potential nuclear war is a surprise. Remember, harken back to the day of President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, who were seconds, maybe minutes away from a nuclear war, and they did not even have what we now consider standard technology for this era, which is a red phone in the president's office. The president couldn't just pick up the phone, talk to Khrushchev, and say, let's call this thing off. So these things were developed over time, And one of the things that we started off with was the Skunk Works. Kelly Johnson took his F-104, highly modified it, as he said, and created the U-2 that could fly well above 50,000 feet and but very slowly, and fly over enemy territory and find those missiles that were sitting in Cuba, and find the missiles in Russia, and see where their bombers are, and come back and give us the film and show us exactly what's going on. Now, well, let's just go on to the next chart. This is a history photo that everybody here should recognize. The man in the dock there, of course, is the famous Francis Gary Powers, who was shot down in his U-2, and which led to us making promises to Russia as part of backing off from the brink, that we would not be flying over their territory, and also which led to us coming up with an aircraft that could go so fast they couldn't shoot it down. I want to go back to Francis Gary Powers for just a moment, because history is just a wonderful, wonderful stories throughout. And Francis Gary Powers is a great story. If you haven't read about him, if you haven't heard about him, let me just tell you that he didn't remain in prison in Russia. I believe there's a recent movie that shows him being traded across the famous bridge in Berlin, but he ended his last half of his life. He was a helicopter traffic reporter in Los Angeles. So hopefully some of you know the history of your city down there, that he actually, the way he died was in a helicopter crash and over Los Angeles reporting traffic. So SR-71. If you're going to have a very fast aircraft that can outrun any sort of offensive measures that another nation might launch against you, that means you're going to be going very high and very fast. And Francis Gary Powers and the other U-2 pilots, of course, were wearing pressure suits. I like to call them space suits, but they're more precisely called pressure suits. Anytime you're above 50,000 feet, there's just not enough air up there, and you need to be wearing a pressure suit. The SR-71, highly classified in the late 70s, early 80s. Now you can go online and you can download the pilot's manual, and you can see that they were probably flying about 70, 80,000 feet, probably about Mach 3.3, but those numbers would have gotten me fired if I had repeated them to you back in the 1970s. This particular aircraft has the raised back seat. So that's, I believe, the one that we have here at the Hill Aerospace Museum at Hill Air Force Base. Let's see, let's go on, talk some more about SRs. The A-12, of course, was already in work and being flown by the CIA. So there's all of that backstory that you could dig into if you enjoy that sort of thing. And again, all that's declassified. Some wonderful YouTube videos out there of SR-71s being built, stories about how we fooled the Russians into selling the titanium to us to build recon SR-71s to spy on them. There's some dates of service there. You probably, being aerospace folks, know that it was retired briefly, and the reincarnation that came back actually had some real-time capability. But the version I was supporting, you had to come back and land and develop the film and download the information. At the period of time I was flying, my main base was in Beale Air Force Base. That's where the tankers were stationed and the SRs were stationed. But we had 4 operating bases at Kadena Air Base, and nowadays is Japan. Back then it was American territory, and RAF Mildenhall in the UK. And Mildenhall's been in the news lately as being taken off the, they were going to move all of the tankers out of Mildenhall, but now they're retaining the tankers. So during the time I was flying tankers and going to Mildenhall, the drill is that you would go support the European Tanker Task Force, and you would wind up in some sort of a pool of crews and pool of tankers where most of the time you were probably going to be refueling F4s flying out of Germany. But you would also get the SR-71 missions. And so when you had an SR-71 mission, you were flying your own KC-135Q aircraft to support that mission. And you had various other rules and procedures that were very different from the usual. Kadena, we basically were a debt. We went over there with the SRs and we went over there with our aircraft, and we were not flying any missions in support of any other aircraft. It's interesting that I have done several talks at Hill Air Force Base and the Hill Aerospace Museum. And anytime you're up here in northern Utah, you definitely want to come by and see the museum. It's open again, limited hours, and it's a huge museum. You can easily get your social distancing. You will have to wear a mask. But the point of mentioning all this is that people often say, why in the world would Hill Air Force Base have an SR-71? They had nothing to do with the mission. Well, it was a very convenient abort base. And of course, the technology was such that very often things went wrong and the SR would have to abort. The tanker would fly in there. I've flown into Hill with my tanker and basically bring in whatever pieces and parts you needed to fix the airplane, refuel it on the ground, and then it would take off from Hill to get back to Beale. Now here's one of the really first things that you talk about when you talk about the SR-71 is that it goes fast. It goes faster than any other manned air-breathing aircraft. And when I first created this chart a few years ago, I really truly believed that it would always hold the speed record for air-breathing piloted aircraft. But now you're seeing in the news that there is a serious endeavor taking place to build a sort of a SR-71 for the airlines. In fact, to be able to put in maybe a dozen people into a Mach 3 aircraft that will serve as a transport. Why? I guess they've decided there's a business case and they can sell the tickets to the very, very rich people that could afford them. But that's something to look forward to after you make your first billion. By then, they should have that airliner built and you could catch a ride on a Mach 3 aircraft. The other thing, of course, that's been in the news is the SR-72, which I've always said if there is a replacement that goes faster and farther and better, it's going to be somebody without a pilot in it, and that's what the SR-72 is, and you'll see that flying soon. Now, this is just to sort of answer the question of, gee, people say that the SR-71 goes as fast as a rifle bullet. And so I thought, well, I'm an engineer, I can do math. Let me figure that out. So this chart shows you, yeah, it turns out it's a 338 Winchester Magnum is probably the closest analogy there. But this chart, and I think you probably all are pretty good at reading pressure altitude versus true airspeed Mach charts. But basically, the lines going across from the top to the bottom are Mach numbers. And so up in the upper right, you can see where the SR-71 is flying when it's doing its mission. Down in the lower left, you can see where they flew when they were being air refueled, which is a huge envelope. And basically, when we're air refueling them, the tanker is on the very edge of its envelope, and so is the SR-71 on opposite edges. I'll have a picture here pretty soon showing the incredible angle of attack of the SR, and the tanker appears to have zero angle of attack because it's going so fast. And one of the Q&A questions I got was, hey, great charts, thank you. Hopefully they can be made available, and the answer is absolutely yes. I'm sure that Ken will make them available, but you can also find them available on my website. So next chart, if you are an SR-71 pilot, you start down there in the lower left-hand side, taking off from, say, Beale Air Force Base. And as you can see, the very first thing you do before you climb to 78,000 feet is you hit your tanker immediately upon taking off. So very typical day for a tanker pilot like me would be to get together with my one or two other tankers, taxi out to the end of the runway at Beale and take off and be in position and waiting and radio back that we're all ready to go up there at the first refueling point. Meanwhile, if I can imagine myself in the second wave of tankers who are taxiing out to out of their taxiway and towards the runway, and in some cases following the SR-71 who's about to take off and hit that first formation of tankers. We're following behind him, getting in position to be that second group of tankers, which you see in the blue ribbon in the middle top of the page. So I have many, many memories of watching an SR-71 taxi out to the end of the runway as it's leaking fuel like crazy. And I'll have more on that later. But as you could see in the red ribbon, that's sort of a, you know, the fastest, shortest mission you could possibly run. And you didn't do that very often. More often you had at least 2 air refuelings, sometimes 3 or more, and which meant that you had probably 3 ship tankers for each one of those refueling points. So it was a very large logistics effort, if I can put it that way, to get that SR-71 in the air and supporting a particular mission. I'll just mention at this point in time, one of the more interesting missions was when we would fly out of Beale in support of reconnaissance against a small island off of Florida. You may have heard of it, called Cuba. We were still worried back then about what they had and what they were plotting and what they might be having show up in their ports and all. And so there were missions down to Cuba. And basically you would have tankers stretched all the way across the United States for this one SR to take up out of Beale, get his refueling, get his recon in Cuba, and then hit a couple of, and then come back. So, and depending upon what the other targets were in that mission, you might have a fairly large gaggle of tankers across the country. You might have 2 or 3 SR-71s who had other targets. And the thing that I found not so funny at the time was, as you flew across the United States in your tanker, you basically were working with air traffic control as though you were just a regular refueling mission. But you would give them some sort of a code word like, you know, Operation Paperclip or something, where they were supposed to go, oh, and then open their book. The air traffic controller would open their book and go, oh, I see, this is a secret mission, and I'm not supposed to say that they're about to go refuel an SR-71. And so the first thing a lot of these air traffic controllers would do as soon as they open the book, they would go, oh, you're the guys with the SR, which was not great OPSEC, but I guess it worked as well as it could. Here's some more engineering stuff about when you're flying fast, you're flying very, very hot. And so you need to take the material that's usually reserved for the very hot parts of a jet engine and build an entire aircraft out of it. And these are some of the example temperatures that we're talking about for flying an SR-71. Let's just mention, for instance, the forward cockpit canopy on the inside was not something that you would want to touch even with your pressure suit on. You couldn't really jump up and grab the canopy right after landing. The coefficient of thermal expansion, of course, was the big bugaboo for building an aircraft entirely out of titanium. Hopefully we could think of better materials nowadays, but you know, composites and such. But back then, titanium was really the only choice, and its coefficient of thermal expansion was basically unacceptable. And it caused a great deal of creativity on the part of the engineers who built it. The whole aircraft could actually expand several inches when it was going fast and hot. And of course, what that meant is that the plates that were pieces of the aircraft put together, the plates would expand and they would seal up that leaking I was talking about. I referred to watching the SR-71 taxiing out in front of us, leaking like crazy. Well, yeah, they're going to leak like crazy because you have to leave room for the plates to push together. And then, you know, once that happens, it sort of seals the fuel inside. So some of these pictures you'll see in a few minutes of air refueling, one of the ways we could tell when we got that SR full was we could see the fuel spilling out of it across the top of the wing. But this particular chart is to introduce the fact that you can't really use regular fuel. JP4, which was what we used back then, would auto combust at 450 degrees. So the fuel that they settled on back in the 50s was JP7, which they called it, they referred to this sort of auto combust phrase, but really it might not even apply when you get something that won't auto combust way above 1,000 degrees. But let's see, I've got words there about JP4s. I got, so let's mention this idea that JP7 is the safe fuel to fly in an aircraft that creates that kind of temperatures. In fact, JP7 has a really, really tough time igniting, and you'll see in some charts I'll show you in a minute the lengths they go to start the engines on an SR-71. This also, of course, is one of the several reasons why you had to develop a KC-135Q aircraft. KC-135Q, which is what I flew in support of the SR-71, has two separate systems of holding fuel. And if we have the time, I have a chart later on that shows all of the JP7 tanks are in the body, the fuselage of the aircraft from nose to tip, nose to tail. And the JP4 fuel that the KC-135 burns is in the wings. So when you're taking off in a KC-135Q, you're burning JP4. So when you're in the you're in the parking area, you're starting your engines with JP4, you're taxiing out, you're flying, you go offload your JP7 fuel, but now you have JP7 left over, and if you were flying at cruise, you can, now that the engines are turning and burning, you can actually burn that JP7 and the tanker J57 Pratt & Whitney engines. The problem is, and this was a definite problem back in those days, is if your engine stops turning and burning, you can't restart it. So if you're going to fly, if you're going to burn JP7 fuel, you need to be at altitude and flying cruise so that if you start having an issue with an engine and need to relight it, you can switch over to your JP4 fuel to relight your engine. So just sort of a side note. SR-71 weight, you see that it carries more fuel than the aircraft weighs empty. And it needs it, of course, because in order to achieve those speeds at those altitudes, it really needs to have a lot of fuel going through those J58 engines. And I've got some charts and videos later on the J58 engine. It's a modern miracle in itself. I also mentioned at this point, for the KC-135, the dry weight was 110,000 pounds. And when you were filled with fuel, you're almost 300,000 pounds. So you had the experience of flying almost two completely different aircraft when you're flying an empty tanker versus a full tanker. And for those of you who haven't thought through it that much, it's much more comfortable flying a full tanker because empty tankers have way too much fumes in those tanks all throughout the aircraft. And there have been tankers that have exploded from the fumes in their tanks. Let's see. So this is the this is the story about how do you get that fuel that doesn't want to burn. First of all, JP7, if you were to touch it, feels sort of very slippery, hard to start. Like I said, it's got fluorocarbons in it because there's some areas that need lubrication within the design of the SR. Let's see, and then the cesium compound, that's another one of those little known things back in the 70s and 80s. But the thing that I really wanted to mention here was that for engine start, you took a couple of Buick Wildcat engines. You probably heard this story once already, where you start the J58 engine spinning and you throw in this chemical, triethylborane, TEB. And the thing about TEB is that it explodes. It says it ignites here, but basically it explodes when it's in contact with just normal atmosphere. So that greenish hue on the picture there is the TEB, which is exploding and igniting the JP7. And SR-71s actually carry aboard small amounts of TEB so that they can restart their engines if they have to, and it has come in handy for them in the future. Now, 20 fluid ounces, was enough that they could carry on board. Unfortunately, during the time that I was a tanker pilot, and remember I talked about this idea that sometimes we had to carry things to other bases for the SR. One of those things was a small barrel, probably about a 3-foot tall barrel of TEB. And generally, when we had to haul that in the back of the aircraft, we would, the boom operator, who's also the load master, would basically position it next to the door halfway down the fuselage in this sort of, like my boom operator said, he said, it just makes me feel better, even though I know it's really useless. Because if there's a breach in that barrel, it basically explodes, and you're going to blow a hole through the side of the airplane, and you're not going to be able to get there and open the door in flight, depressurize the aircraft, open the door in flight, and kick the barrel over. If you think something bad is about to happen, it's probably already happened. And I'll just relate a story that occurred while I was flying at Beale Air Force Base, where we were bringing back a whole group of people back from Kadena, including one of them happened to be a flight surgeon. And one of those barrels was offloaded, and somehow, some way, it developed a crack or a leak in the top of it as the airman was hoisting it across the tarmac, and it quite literally blew the top of his head off. And basically everything above his eyebrows was gone, and the flight surgeon was right there trying to help him, but there was really nothing he could do. So back in the day when we did some things that were probably more dangerous than we should have done, but then just getting in an aircraft sometimes made you wonder. I'll just mention this story right now while I'm on the topic of the dangers of flying tankers. In the late 70s, we had J57 engines, which of course were water injected, and there'll be charts showing that. And one of the characteristics of the J57 engine was it really liked to throw its blades and tear itself apart. So for aircraft engines, it's fairly likely that one would blow up sometime, maybe once or twice during the year. And so we practiced 3-engine maneuvers all the time. 3-engine, say you're taking off, rolling down the runway, and engine explodes. After you're at your takeoff speed, then you're taking off on 3 engines. So we would practice that. Well, the smart engineers at Wright-Patt came up with this idea, which all of us air crews and pilot, well, I should say air crews, I should say pilots. They told us pilots, hey, we've got this engine condition monitoring form we would like you to fill out every time that you fly, and so that we can start to track how your engines are doing. And it's very easy. Just take a minute out of your 2-hour cruise and just push a couple of throttles up and pull a couple back, and then go back and do the other ones, and just write down what you see on the dials in front of you. And if you do that, we're going to stop these engines blowing up on you, because we're going to predict when we need to swap them out. And for that brief period of time, I'd say it was about 6 weeks, where we first started doing that, you couldn't get around all the grousing and complaining and moaning around the fact that all you had to do was write down a few numbers on a sheet of paper. But, you know, Air Force guys, especially combat crews, if you couldn't complain about something, you probably just didn't have a good enough day. So they complained bitterly about that for about 6 weeks, until they started to notice, we started to notice, hey, these engines aren't blowing up on us anymore. So then we thought that was the greatest thing in the world, and we were more than happy to fill out those sheets of paper. So anyway, this is a story about the sealants, and you can see an SR-71 taking off, and somebody got a nice amateur photo of all of that fuel that's been leaking around the bottom of the aircraft. You see the nose gear hasn't quite come back up into the fuselage yet, and all that lighter area underneath the aircraft is fuel leaking. And you know, that's one of the big reasons why this guy, he's got a full load of fuel, well, not quite a full load of fuel to take off, so that he has a safe takeoff. So it's not completely full, but he has a safe takeoff. He's leaking fuel all the way down the taxiway. So leaking fuel as he takes off. He's leaking fuel as he climbs out. So when he gets to that first group of tankers you saw on the red ribbon, he really needs fuel. He needs it really bad. The picture on the left there is where his fuel tanks are located. And again, all this stuff is out there on the internet nowadays. None of it's classified anymore. So there's another nice picture showing that sort of sheen along the bottom as the gear come up. And you can see that the fuel there. And just threw this in there in case you wanted to look a little closer at those fuel tanks. And then this is to the trained eye. This is SR-71 who has just finished refueling. You can see that because that red rectangle behind the two cockpits is where the boom is inserted. And basically with all the other aircraft, you had a certain amount of fuel that they were scheduled to get depending on their mission. With the SR-71, you wanted to give him as much fuel as possible because fuel is what limits his mission. And so basically, instead of shutting off the pumps up in the cockpit when you get to the amount of fuel you think he needs, we would always pressure disconnect. That is, we would keep pumping until the automatic override and the boom would disconnect. And invariably, that's at the same time that you can actually see the fuel leaking over the top of the aircraft. And the first thing he wants to do immediately upon getting that full load of fuel is to shoot up into the air and get the fastest speed he can so that he can trap that fuel in there as the titanium expands. When you're taking off or flying SR-71 in Afterburner, it does have the classic diamonds in there. And every Tuesday night, actually, I could go out in my backyard at Beale Air Force Base and watch the night flights take off of the SRs, unless I was supporting them. But if I wasn't, then I could stand there in my backyard, watch these guys take off, see it rotate, and you could actually see those diamonds hit the runway and reflect off and still retain their diamond shape. That's how much power is coming out of the back end of that J-58. I might also mention, even though the fact that I knew as much about these aircraft as anybody, they still looked like UFOs to me from the vantage point of my backyard. So as I mentioned earlier, carrying the high flash point fuel and supporting the SR-71 meant that you had to have certain modifications to the tanker itself, which made it a Q model. You had to have changes to the way that the crew operated. And so you had special crews there at Beale that were just trained over and over again in the capability of refueling SR-71s worldwide. As I mentioned earlier about the body tanks and the wing tanks, I forgot to mention the 2 ground refueling ports. If you go to any tanker in any museum, you can find the refueling port underneath. I think it's the JP4 one is underneath the left wing, so that's where all the A models have them. But if you go over to the other, if it's a Q model, you go over, well, nowadays a T model. If you go over to the other wheel well, you'll see another refueling point in the other wheel well. So that's a modification. You had special strobe lights that weren't on tankers, special secret squirrel comm that was encrypted in K-box and all that stuff. What did they call those back then? KG-13, I think it was. Boom interphone, all tankers have boom interphones now, but they had them only on the Q models back then. And so we would be flying radio silent as much as we could. Sometimes the first time we would be able to talk to the other pilot in the SR was over the boom interphone, and he'd be connected in our interphone system. And very often, the most important thing we would say is something like, let's get the hell away from this thunderstorm, or something like that. Thunderstorms are no joke. You don't want to be anywhere near them. But if you've got a mission priority to meet an SR at a certain place, radio silent, you can't not show up. So if it's really, really bad, you can break radio silence. If it's only really bad, you can hook up, talk on the boom interphone, and get away from that area. We did have a tanker out of Beale one day. It was just on a regular mission. I don't even think it was SR-71 mission, and it was flying in an area that was supposed to be free of thunderstorms, but all of a sudden they were socked in and couldn't see anything. And so they were starting to get permission from air traffic control to fly to a different flight level so that they could see what was ahead of them, because their weather radar, we have a radar in the nose that can look for thunderstorm cells, and their radar wasn't working. So about the time they got the air traffic control permission, which was just a couple of minutes, they blundered into a major thunderstorm. And that thunderstorm basically grabbed them going at, what would it have been, 300 knots, 30,000 feet, and just tossed to this 250,000 pound aircraft to the top of the thunderstorm cell at, so it's probably about 40,000 feet and 0 airspeed. And with of course, with 0 airspeed, you have 0 control, and you could easily fall into a spin, and people would just wonder what happened. Fortunately for these guys, they sort of bent over on one wing and started to go into a dive, regain control of the aircraft, and were able to steer away from the cell and come back and tell us the story, or else probably never could have quite figured out what happened to them. So part of the crew training, of course, I talked about the radio silent. The take command part is you basically have to, as an aircraft commander in a tanker supporting SR-71s, you basically were given a huge amount of responsibility. You were given a mission tasked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to get recon that's required by the top level, sometimes the president. And so these were very, very high priority missions that could fail if the tanker pilot didn't do his job. And so, for instance, I'll give you a practical example. One time I was supposed to take off a 2-ship formation out of another base, it wasn't Beale, and refuel an SR-71, and there were thunderstorms that were moving across the field at this remote location. And the local commander there, a full colonel, I was a captain at the time, was getting extremely nervous because he knew this was a high priority JCS mission. And there I was sitting on the edge of the runway, not taking off, and calculating how fast those thunderstorms were moving, how fast I could get to the refueling point, what was the safest option for me and my crew and the second aircraft to take off with these thunderstorms in the area and still make the mission. And to the credit of that colonel, he would call me up and give me regular weather reports, but at no time did he say, I think you should take off now. He left that up to me. And that sort of responsibility early on in your career, remember this was my first assignment in the Air Force, really helps build you to a position where you can take leadership later in your career. And I've got a story associated with that too, but I don't think I want to spend the time right now, maybe in the Q&A if anybody's interested. But formation flying. This was the formation that we flew, because if you remember what an SR-71 cockpit looks like, in that upper left-hand corner, you got these tiny little windows on the side, and the guy is looking through those windows through a pressure suit. So his line of sight is not really great. And so you're not really flying a standard sort of V-type formation with the three tankers. You're flying almost line abreast, and so that the SR-71 can see you, and so that you can see each other. And we all stay out of everybody else's way. And those of you who know something about aircraft dynamics know that if you position an aircraft below and slightly behind another aircraft, if that receiver aircraft moves forward too much, the dynamics of the pressure along the top of the wing of the receiver and the pressure along the top of the bottom of the wing of the tanker basically tries to force those two aircraft together. So anytime you're in a air refueling position, you are in a sort of a dangerous position where collisions can happen very, very easily. And so the last thing you want to do is to lose sight of where the other aircraft are. And once that SR-71 gets the fuel off of the first aircraft, that aircraft moves up and over and in third place in such a way that the SR can keep an eye on him as well as he maneuvers to go hit the number 2 aircraft for fuel. And you'll fly in 2 and 3 ship formations so that, well, one of the good things about doing it this way is that all the aircraft can return to base because none of them have given up all of their fuel. The other thing is that if you get in the air and something goes wrong and you can't transfer fuel, then one of the aircraft can still go ahead and transfer all the fuel the SR needs and then land immediately at an abort base right below him. And so there's all sorts of these strategies and logistics planning ideas that go into coming up with this concept. And I think I will go ahead and tell a little story here about Beale cruise flying formation. There wasn't a lot of tanker formation flying in the late 70s and early 80s. So during a Bright Star exercise when we were deployed in Europe, somebody decided, apparently fairly high up, that what would be a great demonstration during this Bright Star would be to have a 6-ship of tankers refueling a 6-ship of C-141 transport aircraft. And that would be a wonderful demonstration to show our adversaries just how great we are at this sort of thing. And it was really quite, I think all of us agreed on the flight crews that it was an incredibly reckless and dangerous idea that really didn't have any merit to it at all, but we were all young enough to be quite ready to go try it and say we did it. And what they did was they put Beale crews on the first and second aircraft and a Beale crew on the 6th aircraft, because if the first aircraft had a ground abort, number 2 would slip into its place and it would be lead for this formation. And so the lead of that formation would still be a Beale crew. And then number 6 in this formation, and you might have guessed this possibly, I was the pilot and that guy. And in number 6, the idea was you're such a good formation flying pilot, in this big heavy tanker that just doesn't respond as quickly as you think it should, especially when it's loaded with fuel, that if you get into a game of crack the whip, you'll be in a position to not wind up messing up the entire formation. So anyway, as it turned out, everything went fine. But just as we were done with our pre-flight discussions, before we were about to go out to the aircraft, one of the one-star generals that was there, that would probably be the most likely guy to get fired if we screwed up, came in, talked to us and said, I just have a couple of things to tell you, man. First of all, this is a really stupid idea, and I would really appreciate it if you didn't F it up, only he didn't say F. And then we went out to the aircraft. And I might just, since I'm on a divergence here anyway, as you look at this chart, I said, you men, because yeah, it was all men. This was late 70s. One of the things that happened when I was a co-pilot, so this would have been 81 when this formation flight I'm talking about. And it just so happened that we didn't have any women aboard any of these aircraft. But in 1978, 79, we got our first woman pilot at Beale Air Force Base. And as a co-pilot at that time, and a guy who was apparently thought of as stable because I was married and had kids, they said, you are going to be her buddy, so that she, sort of integrates into the squadron and doesn't have a whole lot of trouble. And having a woman show up back in the late 70s as a pilot in a male-dominated area, there wasn't enough drama to make a made-for-TV movie out of it. But what there was sort of two opinions. When the guys would talk behind. When they felt they could talk safely about what they were thinking, they were of two opinions. One opinion was she's a woman, so obviously she can't fly worth crap. And the other opinion was, well, she's a woman, so obviously she must be extremely capable pilot, or she wouldn't have made it this far. And both of those opinions, frankly, were completely unfair, because she was a pilot like any other pilot. It had good days and bad days, and did a credible job along with everybody else in the squadron. So those days, I hope the days of, a C-141 all-female crew makes it across the Pacific like everybody's surprised. Hopefully those days are behind us. So this is a sort of a repeat of some of the information I gave you earlier, but I guess maybe I didn't really mention that the old J57 engines on a tanker were water injected. You couldn't really get the full capability of fuel on board like you wanted to without putting additional thrust into each engine right at takeoff. So we had a large tank of water, 670 gallons, that we would divert into the engines at the point of takeoff so that we could get that little extra thrust. And every takeoff in a tanker, of course, is exciting, because what you do is you calculate the weather that day and the length of the runway in order to determine how much fuel to put on board. So you're always taking off with maximum fuel. And in theory, once you reach the no-go speed for that particular day, if you were to lose an engine, you could theoretically still take off. But I tell you, some of those takeoffs were pretty exciting. Some of the best ones were out of Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, because that runway isn't entirely flat. And when you get to the end of it, it's a cliff. And so where you're at with that cliff is you are still in ground effect. Ground effect means that as you go off the edge of that cliff, you will wallow down a few dozen feet to the point where if you're standing on the runway, you can't see the aircraft anymore, because it's wallowed down across that cliff until it hits ground effect on the Pacific Ocean again, and then starts to go up again. So those were exciting times. Oh, here we go. Charlie, can you recommend a book on the SR-71 history and development, and which presentation on your website do you recommend to start with? So I tell you what, I will answer that question later because that's too hard for me to think about and answer right now. So Ken, help me remember to answer that question later. This is a few stats on today's tanker, which has a lot more thrust and is no longer a water wagon. That graphic there is a little interesting because the SR-71 pilots, you know, most of them were very, very cool guys. Every once in a while you felt that some of them got just a little bit too full of themselves, but really they weren't. They were guys trying to do a job, and I think they were a little bit humbled by the magnitude of the job they were taking on, and so weren't really sort of throwing their weight around that much. But they did get to wear those nifty Mach 3+ patches on their uniforms, and we were a little bit jealous. So as tanker guys, we got a Mach 0.77+ patch to wear on our uniforms, our flight suits. That brings to mind the fact that if you're flying at 0.77 Mach, which is the air refueling speed, your top envelope, because that's where you start to get shock waves forming on the what's it called, the engine mounts on your tanker. So what I wanted to say about this chart, though, is that the neat thing about the new KC-135Rs is that they're done with redoing all of the wings. When I was flying tankers, we had this irritating problem where the wings, the structural members in the wings would start to crack. And so if they crack too much, you know, the wing could fall off. So that's not a good thing if you're a pilot. I probably don't have to say that. We had a little yellow light in the cockpit called an acoustic crack detector. And if that yellow light came on, that means the acoustic crack detector heard a crack developing in a structural member of the wing. And so the tech order said, reset the light, and if it comes on again, fly very, very carefully back to your home base. So that was something we lived with. Fortunately, nothing really bad ever happened from our wings cracking, although my buddy, Ned Markle, did have the distinction of having half of his wing get blown off by a lightning strike during an SR-71 refueling. It was that point in time when he had been my aircraft commander, and he was going on to upgrade to instructor pilot, and I was going on to upgrade to aircraft commander. And he was flying one of the flights that would eventually get him qualified to be an instructor pilot. And during that flight, a huge bright flash and explosion occurred out the right side of his aircraft. And it was dramatic enough that he sent the boom operator back to go look at the wing on the right-hand side. And the boom operator went back there. I knew the guy, he told me the story. And he said he went back there and everything looks fine. And he told him over the intercom that everything's fine. And he thought, well, as long as I'm back here, I'll go look at the other wing. The other wing, every part of that wing outboard of the outboard engine was gone. And so he had the opportunity to fly that aircraft back with half a wing on the left-hand side. And as it turns out, Boeing, that was back in the days when Boeing was really making fantastic aircraft. And the amount of control authority he had was such that he said that he really couldn't tell a whole lot of difference between a full wing and a half a wing. So here's a few little notes here about Charlie, your thoughts on the lack of tankers that developed over the last 25 years. I recall waiting for hours before able to launch aircraft over West Coast missions. Well, you know, how much time do I have left? Because I could easily put in 20 minutes on that topic.
Actually, 5 minutes.
Okay. So yeah, I'll try to keep it short, but I'm passionate about this because I worked at Northrop Grumman at the time where we won the bid for the new tanker. And there was so much misinformation going around that bid. But I would just like to put down my marker on the table right now to say that if they hadn't taken that away from us, we would be flying the new tankers, not only now, but several years ago. You would have had those Northrop Grumman tankers flying already. But who knows what the counterfactual is, what would really happen. But one of the big things that just really irks me is how long it's taking us to get the K-46 out there, KC-46 out there and get it working. The tankers, like this chart says, you're not gonna kick ass without tanker gas. You know, everything we do in the Air Force requires tankers to be there and be supporting all of these aircraft that have air refueling built into their missions. And the tankers continue to get older and older and older, and we continue to upgrade them and keep them going. But I really kind of wish that we had that original Northrop Grumman KC-45 flying right now, because we would be in a lot better position. And rather than go on and on and on about that topic, I'll just cut it off there. And if you've got another question along those lines, I can give you my opinion. Because, you know, being retired, happy to give you my opinion on anything. I'm not going to get in trouble with the boss at work. Let's see, anything here on this chart I want to make sure I mention. Yep, the first bullet is apropos to what we were just talking about. In-flight refueling demands that aircraft fly 35 feet apart. SR normally refuels 26,000 feet. I showed you a little bit of the envelope there. Hopefully we get to the chart that shows you the angle of attack of those aircraft. Now, one of the interesting things that happens when you're refueling an SR-71, especially if you're in the South Pacific or even maybe even around Kadena, sometimes the warmth of the air, and probably even worse nowadays with the air getting warmer every year, you can get into a position where you're refueling at 26,000 feet. And well, just let me talk about your basic, when everything goes well, sort of situation. You start at a certain speed because that's the top speed that you can attain. It also happens to be the lowest speed that the SR can attain and still stay in the air. And you're refueling 26,000 feet, you're transferring fuel. The tanker starts to go faster because it can, and the SR-71, of course, goes faster because it really gives it a more comfortable envelope when it does. And so you're normally right there at the edge of the envelope. If you're in warmer air conditions, you could get to a point where you actually have to declare something called a toboggan, which can happen with other receivers as well. It's a standard procedure for tankers and receivers. When you declare a toboggan, that means that the tanker is going to start descending in order to maintain airspeed. And that has happened from time to time with that aircraft and with others. I've never had to be in that position. Let's see. I guess I could talk a little bit about, I think all the rest of this chart speaks for itself. Let's see what else we have to say. I did want to talk about the fact that, again, we're in the late 70s, early 80s. You might not be that familiar with the technology if you're a millennial or younger. And so I threw a few of the bits of technology up here on the screen for you. Back then, you could work on your own car. It was kind of fun to do so. The Apple II was just coming out. GPS was just becoming a thing. It wasn't available yet, but they were starting to be launched in 1978. Got our first feasibility demonstration in '85. So that meant that that map there in the middle bottom shows you some of the, actually that's not the map I was going to reference. Now, I had another map which was of the Pacific, which showed you the Loran sites. So you had Loran that you could get a little bit of navigational information out of. You would use the sextant in the lower right. Like I mentioned earlier, you'd push it up through the roof of the cockpit to shoot the stars in order to navigate across the Pacific. And you would do HF radio check-ins to get across the Pacific. So that's sort of the technology of that time.
Charlie, sorry, 1 minute.
Say again?
1 minute.
Oh, are we that
We're
late?
almost time.
Oh, sorry. I really got to going, didn't I?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, these last few charts are just a lot of gee whiz stuff that I put in there so that I could be able to do this, and you could look at them later. And there's a picture of the angle of attack. And there is me at the Air Force Museum reminding us that the Cold War ended in 1991 and they disbanded Strategic Air Command in 1992. So if anybody, well, I guess we don't have time for Q&A at this point, do we? I need to introduce our next speaker. I apologize.
I think we can ask the people to type in a question that we'll forward to you. And
Yeah.
then maybe we can have you back another time and address more of the later part of the talk.
Yeah,
And
so
the new development of the tankers, those things.
So much I would like to say, like for instance, what the heck makes you think the Cold War is over? Anyway, let's see.
Yeah,
I need to give you your screen sharing back.